The diner was loud 1 second and dead silent the next. A sharp slap echoed through the room as an elderly black woman froze in her seat, her hand rising to her burning cheek. "Apologize," the man snapped, standing over her like she was nothing. No one moved. No one spoke. Plates sat untouched. Eyes dropped in fear. She whispered, "I didn't mean to," but it didn't matter. What no one in that diner understood was that this humiliation wasn't the end of the story. She wasn't just waiting for breakfast. She was waiting for someone. And when that door opened, everything was about to change. How long can cruelty rule before it meets the truth it never expected? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Mornings in Ridgeway Crossing followed a rhythm most people never questioned. The same cars rolled past the same storefronts. The same faces filled the same booths. For many, that predictability meant comfort. For Evelyn Moore, it meant survival. At her age, routine wasn't boredom. It was safety. It was knowing where she was tolerated and where she wasn't welcome at all. Evelyn had lived in this town long enough to understand how silence worked. She dressed neatly, moved carefully, and spoke softly, not because she was weak, but because experience had taught her which battles were punished. That morning, she arrived at Sunrise Corner Cafe just after sunrise, her sky blue coat buttoned neatly, her posture steady despite the years weighing on her joints. She greeted the cashier with a polite nod and a quiet, "Good morning," then waited to be shown a table. The cafe was already busy. Plates clinked. Coffee steamed. Conversation stayed low. People in Ridgeway Crossing had learned not to draw attention to themselves, especially around certain men. Richard Halverson sat near the center of the diner, boots stretched into the aisle like he owned the place. No one ever asked him to move. They simply adjusted their paths and kept their heads down. Evelyn didn't see him at first. She was focused on the table she'd been told to wait at, her thoughts drifting to the reason she was there. Someone had asked her to meet that morning. The request had come quietly, through a friend, without explanation. She didn't ask questions. Something about it felt important, personal. She trusted that feeling. As she passed through the narrow aisle, her coat brushed lightly against a boot. It was barely a touch, nothing she even noticed. She reached her seat and folded her hands in her lap, breathing slowly, waiting. That was when the scrape of a chair cut through the diner. Richard Halverson noticed everything. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. The room tightened instantly. Evelyn turned, surprised but composed. "I'm sorry," she said gently, already preparing to move on the way she always had. Apologies had become second nature in a town like this. But Ridgeway Crossing had a habit of reminding people like Evelyn Moore that politeness wasn't always enough. No one in the cafe intervened. The cashier froze. Customers stared into their plates. Fear settled in the room like a familiar guest. And what Evelyn didn't know, what no one else knew, was that this moment was only the beginning. The man she was waiting for hadn't arrived yet. But he was already on his way. The room stayed frozen after the slap, like time itself had decided not to interfere. Evelyn Moore felt the sting spreading across her cheek, heat pulsing beneath her skin as she tried to steady her breathing. She focused on the edge of the table, on the pattern in the floor, on anything that would keep her grounded. Around her, Sunrise Corner Cafe felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had moved in to witness what no one was stopping. Richard Halverson remained standing over her, chest rising with satisfaction. He didn't rush. He never did. He knew fear worked better when it was slow. "You hear me?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "I said, apologize." His eyes scanned the room again, daring someone, anyone, to challenge him. No one met his gaze. Evelyn's hand trembled as she pressed it to her face. "I didn't mean to," she said again, quieter this time. "It was an accident." The words tasted familiar. She had spoken them too many times in her life. Behind the counter, the cashier stood stiff, hands locked together, eyes wide. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one stood. Silence wrapped itself around the diner, heavy and practiced. Ridgeway Crossing had learned this lesson long ago. Survival came from staying out of the way. Richard Halverson leaned closer, invading Evelyn's space. "You people are always so careless," he muttered, the words soaked in something darker than anger. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Not in surrender, but in protection. She reminded herself why she was there. She wasn't alone. Someone was coming. The bell above the diner door chimed. At first, it barely registered. The tension in the room was too thick. Then footsteps crossed the threshold, measured, deliberate. Cameron Moore stepped inside and paused just long enough to read the scene. Chairs pushed back. A woman on the floor. A man looming. Years of instinct kicked in before thought could catch up. Cameron's eyes found Evelyn instantly. The red mark on her cheek. The way she held herself, even in pain. His jaw tightened as recognition hit. "Mom!" he said quietly. Evelyn looked up, confusion giving way to disbelief. "Cameron?" Her voice wavered despite her effort to stay composed. Relief and fear collided in her chest at once. Richard Halverson turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. He looked Cameron up and down, assessing, measuring. For a brief moment, hesitation flickered. Cameron Moore stood tall, broad-shouldered, calm in a way that didn't ask permission, the kind of calm shaped by discipline and restraint. "Mind your business," Richard snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Cameron didn't respond. He moved instead, stepping between Richard and Evelyn, his presence firm but controlled. He crouched beside his mother, his voice lowering. "Are you hurt?" Evelyn hesitated. Old habits told her to minimize, to protect the peace at any cost. But something in her son's eyes, clarity, certainty cut through that instinct. She nodded once. "He hit me," she said softly. The diner seemed to inhale all at once. Behind Cameron, Richard scoffed. "She bumped into me," he said loudly. "She needed to learn some manners." His words grew sharper as he spoke, unraveling. He took a step closer, still convinced the room would protect him through silence. What Richard Halverson didn't realize was that silence had shifted. Cameron rose slowly, placing himself fully between Richard and Evelyn Moore. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind that came from years of training. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. "You don't touch her," he said. The words landed heavy. Richard laughed, short and hollow. "You think you scare me?" he snapped. "I run this place." He glanced around, expecting agreement. He found none. The room remained silent, but something in that silence had changed. Evelyn reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing Cameron's sleeve. Not to stop him, but to remind him she was still there. Cameron didn't move. His posture stayed steady, his focus unbroken. Richard Halverson's face darkened as his authority slipped. He stepped closer again, invading Cameron's space, pushing the boundary the way he always had. "Get out of my way," he said. Cameron didn't flinch. The tension coiled tighter, stretching thin. Plates rattled as someone shifted in their booth. The cashier swallowed hard. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone felt it coming. Ridgeway Crossing had never seen Richard challenged like this before, and Cameron Moore, calm, controlled, unyielding, stood his ground. Richard made his decision. He shoved Cameron. The impact was sudden, careless, arrogant. Cameron stumbled back half a step, absorbing the force, his balance steadying instantly. The room held its breath, because in that moment, restraint hung by a thread, and whatever came next would change everything. The shove landed without warning, sharp and careless, driven by arrogance more than strength. Cameron Moore absorbed it instinctively, his boots sliding back just enough to reset his balance. For half a second, everything paused. The lights hummed. A coffee cup rattled against the saucer. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Richard Halverson smirked, mistaking control for weakness. "That's what I thought," he muttered, stepping forward again. He raised his hands as if daring Cameron to react, his voice rising, feeding on the tension he created for years. Cameron didn't answer right away. His chest rose once, slow and deliberate. His eyes flicked briefly to Evelyn Moore, still shaken, still standing, still watching him with fear and trust tangled together. That glance settled something inside him. When he turned back to Richard Halverson, the calm didn't disappear. It sharpened. "Step back!" Cameron said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the noise in the room like a blade. Richard laughed again, louder this time, but there was uncertainty beneath it. He took another step, crowding Cameron's space, trying to reclaim dominance the only way he knew how. That was the moment restraint gave way to consequence. Cameron moved with precision, not rage. One motion flowed into the next, controlled, efficient, unmistakably trained. Richard's confidence collapsed almost instantly as the first strike landed, snapping his head to the side and knocking the breath from his chest. Gasps erupted around the diner. Before Richard could regain his footing, another blow followed, then another, each one measured, each one deliberate. This wasn't chaos. This was discipline. Richard Halverson stumbled backward and crashed to the floor, chairs scraping as people finally recoiled. Blood spilled from his mouth as panic replaced entitlement. He scrambled, hands raised now, voice cracking. "Stop, please. I didn't know," he cried. "I didn't know she was your mother." Cameron stood over him, breathing steady, fists clenched but controlled. "That doesn't matter," he said. The room was silent except for Richard's sobbing. The man who had ruled Ridgeway Crossing through fear lay exposed on the floor, stripped of the power he'd wielded for so long. No one rushed to help him. No one spoke for him. The silence that had once protected him now judged him. Evelyn Moore took a step forward, steadying herself against a table. Her cheek throbbed, her hand shook, but she remained upright. Her eyes met her son's. There was fear there, but also relief. She didn't tell him to stop. She didn't tell him to go further. She simply looked at him, and that was enough. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone had finally called the police. Cameron exhaled once and stepped back, lifting his hand slowly, showing restraint even now. He adjusted his jacket, wiped the blood from his knuckles against his jeans, and waited. Richard Halverson curled inward on the floor, whispering apologies that carried no weight anymore. When the doors of Sunrise Corner Cafe swung open and officers entered, the scene told its own story. Richard was injured and panicked. Evelyn Moore stood marked but unbroken. Cameron Moore stood calm, hands visible, eyes steady. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "What happened here?" an officer asked. "That man struck my mother," Cameron said evenly. "I intervened." Richard tried to protest, his voice shrill with desperation, but the room spoke over him. Customers pointed. The cashier nodded. Fear loosened its grip as truth finally found a voice. An officer gestured toward the cameras mounted above the counter. "Pull the footage." They watched in silence. The slap, the silence, the shove. There was no debate after that. As cuffs clicked around Richard Halverson's wrists, the man who had terrorized the town for years looked smaller than anyone remembered. He was led toward the door without a single defender in sight. Cameron remained where he was, waiting, composed, because the worst moment had passed, and what came next would determine whether justice truly followed. The sirens stopped just outside Sunrise Corner Cafe, their sound cutting through what little tension remained in the room. When the officers from the Ridgeway Crossing Police Department stepped inside, they didn't need long to understand what had happened. The scene spoke for itself. Richard Halverson lay on the floor, bloodied and shaking. Evelyn Moore stood nearby, her cheek marked, but her posture unbroken. And Cameron Moore stood calmly to the side, hands visible, breathing steady. "What happened here?" one officer asked. "That man struck my mother," Cameron said evenly. "I intervened." This time, the silence didn't protect the wrong person. Cafe customers spoke up, some hesitantly, others all at once. The cashier nodded, pointing toward the cameras. Surveillance footage confirmed every moment, the slap, the fear, the shove. There was no room left for excuses. Richard Halverson was lifted to his feet and placed in handcuffs, his authority dissolving as quickly as it had once dominated the town. No one looked at him as he was led out. No one defended him. As officers finished their questions, something else became clear. Cameron Moore wasn't just a man who reacted in anger. His control, restraint, and precision reflected years of military discipline. When an officer quietly acknowledged his background, the truth settled in fully. Cameron was a Navy SEAL, home off duty, drawn into violence only to protect his mother. That detail didn't excuse the moment. It explained it. Evelyn Moore sat beside her son afterward, her hand resting in his. The pain in her cheek would fade, but the humiliation would linger. Still, something had changed. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because silence had finally been broken. In the days that followed, Sunrise Corner Cafe returned to serving coffee and breakfast. But Ridgeway Crossing did not return to what it had been. People spoke more freely. Eyes didn't drop as quickly. Fear loosened its grip. Richard Halverson lost more than his freedom. His reputation, his power, his place in the town collapsed with him. This wasn't just a story about one slap in a diner. It was about how racism survives when people look away and how quickly it weakens when someone refuses to stay silent. Evelyn Moore didn't seek confrontation. Cameron Moore didn't come looking for justice. But together, they forced a reckoning. The real question is this: how many moments like this pass unnoticed until someone finally decides enough is enough? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. Don't forget to like the video. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.